Though there may be a time and place for drone strikes to be used when there is specific actionable intelligence about a particular individual that is known to be plotting or imminently plotting, violent strikes either against American citizens or U.S. interests. There may in fact be circumstances like that where it's warranted, but to the degree that the drone strikes have started to proliferate and be used far more broadly, that the administration has moved into identifying targets based on sort of the signature strike protocol in looking for suspicious behavior or patterns of behavior. This expansion of the use of drone strikes to that degree, I think, has really become counterproductive and inefficient and ineffective. For us working through the Yemen Policy Initiative here at the Hariri Center, what I'm most concerned about is actually whether or not this is an effective strategy. I'm going to leave the legal arguing to the lawyers, but looking at it solely based on whether or not this is effective in terms of achieving U.S. national security interests. Is this actually undermining and undercutting terrorist networks? Is this actually helping to strengthen and sustain and build and empower Yemeni state institutions and military and security forces or not? And I think what we're starting to see is as the number of strikes increases and as the breadth of targets is so broadened, that there are more civilians caught in the crossfire, there are more innocent bystanders being killed, and the impact of this is actually to create fertile ground for recruitment and much more, many more communities that would be sympathetic to harboring, whether it's AQAP or Ansar al-Sharia or others. And I think that ultimately this is going to undercut our objectives. Not to mention, in addition to actually, again, sort of creating an atmosphere of hostility towards the U.S., it's also generating a lot of resentment and hostility and undercutting the credibility of the Yemeni government. And I think that's probably just as damaging in terms of actually trying to go after, the extremist networks that are there. It requires having a strong Yemeni government, a strong Yemeni military and security forces and apparatus that can actually undertake that mission themselves. That's the only way that this battle is going to be won. It's not going to be won from the air. And I really fear that the way the administration has been pursuing this policy is actually creating more problems than it's solving. I think there's been a shift in opinion over the last couple months, in part because of the rising number of strikes and the number of civilians being killed, in part because there's been more public criticism and comment about the use of drones from a legal perspective, whether it's in Yemen or elsewhere in Africa. And so there's been a bit of a shift, I think, in the tide in terms of the use of drone strikes. Whether or not that actually impacts the administration's decisions, I'm not quite sure. But at least I think that there's much greater scope and room for discussion about whether this is actually working, whether this is actually effective. That kind of discussion really wasn't possible a year ago or 2 years ago. I have sensed a shift in Washington, and so there is a potential opening for there to be some sort of reevaluation or assessment of the policy. The long-term investment in the ability for the government to provide for its citizens in terms of basic services, in terms of creating an environment where there is job creation and young people can find jobs is just absolutely essential, but that's obviously a long-term endeavor. It needs to start now. It's not going to have immediate results. But the only way to get at the drivers that cause people to join up, of course, there those that are ideologically driven, that are, hardcore extremists. But there are many, many people that are doing this because they have no jobs, because it's appealing, because this is what's available to them. And that's, I think, the space that the Yemeni government needs to think creatively about how to address, and the U.S. can support them in doing that. The other piece of it is having, again, a strong, integrated, unified, professional military service with, elite counterterrorism units that are able to actually address these issues on Yemeni terms, rather than it being a U.S.-led initiative. This needs to be really a fight and a battle that Yemenis own and address in their own way. I think actually that the U.S. has been pressuring the GCC countries to the extent that it can, but the reality is you really have to look at this relationship within the regional context, and how many things and how many issues and how many countries the U.S. is going to GCC countries and asking for assistance, whether it's on Syria, whether it's on Libya, whether it's on Egypt. Yemen, unfortunately, is at the end of a long list, probably, of things where the U.S. is seeking, support from various GCC countries. And so I think that those asks probably are being made. They probably could be made maybe more forcefully, or maybe perhaps being bumped to the top of the list of priorities. But that's the unfortunate reality, is that there's a lot of different places of conflict that are demanding their attention. And, certainly for Saudi Arabia, it's absolutely in their interest to have a stable and secure Yemen that has a functioning economy, that has mechanisms to address a humanitarian crisis and internally displaced people. I mean, if there's any country other than Yemen that has more at stake, it's Saudi Arabia. So it's certainly in their interest. As I understand, of the contributions that have been made through the Friends of Yemen process, almost none of the money has come through yet, but I think that is mostly of the fault of the Yemenis, not of the donors, and that many people are waiting for these mechanisms and these processes to get set up within the Yemeni government so that they can actually release some of the funds. Saudi Arabia has contributed, I think, has released $1 billion thus far, but no more than that. And I think it's certainly incumbent upon the Yemeni government to expedite its process to make that happen. I think the U.S. Embassy has done a tremendous job in trying to correct some of the mistakes perhaps in the past, and to reach out more to the Yemeni public. The ambassador certainly had a very public and active role. I think for the most part that's been extremely positive, and I think on balance many Yemenis would recognize that without the explicit engagement and involvement of both the ambassador and the embassy in forming and pushing through the GCC transition plan, it wouldn't have happened otherwise. So I often hear many complaints about the West, the U.S., the GCC. They're pushing too hard. This process needs to remain a Yemeni-led process, and yet at the same time I hear just as many people lament, the Yemeni government can't do this on its own, it needs the international support. So I think given that context, the embassy and its staff have been trying to do the best job that they can. I think there have probably been some times where things were said that shouldn't have been, or other things should have been said that weren't. And I really think that one of the biggest challenges they face is just the security challenges and their inability to travel outside of Sana'a, their inability to get outside sort of the elite circles that they're familiar with and really engage more deeply with a broader cross-section of the community. Unfortunately, security restricts that. I know that they would want to, but I do think that colors a little bit of their perception and their analysis of what's happening, because they just physically aren't able to get out as much as they would want. My biggest fear is that it actually does get sort of bogged down in an impasse, and that the expectations for what the dialogue will achieve are just infeasible, that the depth of issues and the number of issues that this dialogue is supposed to address within 6 months, even if it's extended to 1 year or a year and a half, It's just hard to imagine how this group is going to be able to come to consensus on the stickiest and thorniest issues that have been plaguing Yemen for decades. So my biggest fear is that it just ends up becoming a process in and of itself, and that the process ends up becoming the end goal rather than any real definitive decisions about the nature of the state, how it should be structured, the relationship between cities and provinces and the central government, how they're going to deal with deciding a parliamentary or a mixed parliamentary presidential system. I mean, all of these important decisions have to be made by consensus, and it's difficult to imagine how that's going to come out. So I think it would be extremely helpful in some way for there to be guidelines set up about what would success look like for the national dialogue. It's not going to be perfect, but on what basis can they leave an issue and then move on to the next issue and settle it, and then be able to actually move forward ultimately to revising the Constitution and to elections. Otherwise, we'll be sitting here in 5 years still talking about the national dialogue and waiting for elections. There's actually an excellent paper that was just published on this very question that Charles Schmitz just published in the Carnegie Endowment, and the argument that he makes that I think is absolutely accurate is that Yemen is never going to be able to transform economically based on the revenue from oil and gas. It's really about empowering and creating a productive labor force. Part of that, of course, can be through Gulf countries and through remittances, but ultimately it's really about creating ways for Yemeni workers to be productive in Yemen. And until that's done, it's going to continue to struggle. So what the government needs to be focusing on is how to utilize the international funds that are being made available to create opportunities for labor-intensive industries, for labor-intensive manufacturing, or for other endeavors that will actually capitalize on the fact that there is a huge number of young unemployed people that have some basic education but not very sophisticated technical training, and to figure out ways to provide the training that they need to be more productive. There's certainly some more exploration that can be done in the gas sector and with minerals, but the opportunities for these are going to be limited. It's ultimately got to be about the labor force. I think it would be extremely difficult for the South to be economically independent and to be able to sustain itself. There's very little precedent to think that they would be able to do that successfully, and they certainly don't have the state institutions to be able to sustain that. So I think, though it might seem appealing in the abstract, I think in practicality that would not come to pass at all. It sounds like it would be a nightmare scenario. Certainly, as I mentioned, Saudi Arabia has every interest in helping to sustain and hold Yemen together, as does the U.S. All of the various interests that its neighbors and major players in the region would have would lead them to want Yemen to stay together. Whether this is a federal state with 5-6 major states, or some other political arrangement that allows for greater autonomy, decentralization. All of those things need to be on the table. But I think all efforts would be made by the international community to prevent that kind of armed conflict from breaking out. And I think Yemenis themselves have demonstrated their ability and their willingness to pull back from the brink of armed conflict. For the last year plus, there have been moments where it's been particularly tense, and Ahmed Ali and Ali Mohsen's troops have been sort of poised and ready to go, and yet I think it's actually pretty remarkable that it hasn't deteriorated into armed conflict. And so my hope is, and I think many Yemenis hope that as well, that restraint continues and that there's a way that they can work it out politically. Well, given what's happening in Egypt right now, I would say Yemen's doing pretty well. I think Tunisia has probably had the smoothest transition from a political perspective, but their economy has not improved whatsoever. And so I think most Tunisians are feeling just as frustrated as they were before, or at least close to just as frustrated. But I think in terms of the way that their current coalition government has been able to function thus far, although they're certainly facing some serious challenges and dilemmas right now, and the way that they've undertaken their constitution writing process has been pretty positive. Egypt, on the other hand, I think, is really facing a crisis right now of a lack of consensus. And the Brotherhood really strong-arming their way through. And so I think within that continuum, Yemen probably falls somewhere in between. Well, Islah has been a legal party and functioning and part of political life in Yemen for a long time already. So, it would probably be closer to what you have in Morocco, where the PJD has the majority in parliament and then was able to put forth its candidate for prime minister and form a government. So, part of it depends on what form of government Yemen decides to follow, from ranging from presidential to parliamentary systems. But they clearly have a huge base of support, and their engagement with the revolution probably has helped to sort of score up supporters as well. They have half the government as it is right now, so I would certainly expect in elections that they would win a solid cohort of seats. That's an excellent question and very difficult because so many of them are all interrelated. Dealing with the economic issues is I think, a major priority and not getting nearly enough attention. Dealing with corruption is related to how well they're going to be able to implement economic projects. Addressing humanitarian needs that are widespread, integrating the military forces and security apparatus. It would be really hard to rank these in order. I think those are probably the top 5. And I think a lot of them, again, are interrelated. Without having security, you can't really grow your economy. Without having a stable workforce and, more than 200,000 IDPs still yet, not back in their homes. All of these things are sort of related, but I think some, real underlying issues that affect everything is the lack of security and corruption. I think initially expectations for Hadi were very low and he exceeded them, and then I think expectations for him started to rise, and I think people are starting to become disappointed. I think he has certainly done a very good job in trying to keep together his government, which is a divided government between, former ruling party and the JMP. I think he has tried very hard to move forward on the military restructuring and has taken some very difficult decisions, some very bold decisions about removing Saleh family members. The plan that was just recently approved in terms of restructuring or making changes within the Interior Ministry is also pretty bold. If he's able to actually to implement and actualize a lot of these plans, I think it would go a long way to, again, sort of restoring or instilling some faith and confidence into his leadership. I think he's done a good job in extremely difficult circumstances. I don't know that he is necessarily a dynamic, visionary leader that Yemen could really use at this point, but I'm not sure that person exists.